Hey there, and thanks for watching. So over the next few minutes, I'm going to be walking you through how to use my build to rent development model. So let's get started. Now, if you're familiar with my apartment development model, this model will come very easily to you. And that's because first, the base model that was used to build this BTR development model was my apartment development model. Additionally, the cash flow modeling for a multifamily development is effectively the same as the cash flow modeling for a BTR development model. The difference is really in the labeling and some of the methodologies used for modeling, say, your budget or for modeling your operating cash flows. And I'll show that as we go through the model. Now, if you're unfamiliar with how my models are structured, I try to keep the majority of my outputs, my reports, on one worksheet. I call that the summary tab. You'll find this in all of my development and acquisition models that I've released over the last few years. And then the majority of your inputs will fall on this underwriting tab. Within the left side columns, B through I, blue font cells are inputs, required inputs. You should expect to change every blue font cell in the model. Black font cells are either labels or outputs. Off to the right, then we have our actual cash flows, how they flow in each period. We start with sections. It starts at the top with a description. This is where you're going to drop in descriptive elements of the deal and a few inputs, such as number of lots, number or size of the land, number of garage parking spaces. So if you have 100 homes and they're all two-car garages, you would have 200 garage parking spaces. And then some descriptive element around where the property is located, as well as your analysis begin date. And that will drive then your date header. Now, if you are in a country that does not use square feet, you can toggle to meters instead of square feet. And then your next section is going to be your investment period cash flows. This is where you're going to be modeling your sources and your uses. So if we look at uses or your project budget, we have first your land cost section. And here you're going to have the ability to add or delete items. So imagine that you include in land costs, and this generally is related to land closing, due diligence, closing costs, and so forth. And you'll choose when those cash flows begin and when they end. The method for forecasting those cash flows, whether straight line, S-curve, or detail. You have some outputs, the total amount on a rentable square foot or rentable square meter basis, and then a per home. So in this case here, we're assuming a purchase price of almost $2.6 million. And that's roughly $44,700 per home, or $48.50 per square foot. Now here to the right, columns K through N, you can drop in notes. You can always hide this if you don't want to drop in notes by clicking that button, open it back up. And this is where you just add your underwriting notes. So for instance, seller's asking $2.7 million. We're sizing for something lower than that. Now here I might add, say, a due diligence line item. So I have closing costs, which I assume, say, 3% of my purchase price, and then I might add $50,000 of due diligence. You might also include option fees if you're optioning the land for some period and that's not credited towards your purchase price. That is your land cost section. Again, the method straight line versus S-curve versus detail I'll show here in our next section, hard costs. Now, I've broken hard costs up into horizontal. Those would be things like site and lot improvement, your undergrounds, your off-site improvements, maybe your common area improvements, entryways, and those sort of costs. We think of those as horizontal costs. And you can get as detailed or as summarized as you like. So you might add 8 different items here, 9 different items, 10 items, 20 items. You can really add as many or as few as you want, depending on how cluttered you want this section to be. Now, if I were to have more than probably 5 or 10 items per section, I would actually include a separate custom budget sheet, and then I would link from that budget sheet back to the underwriting tab, which ultimately drives all of my outputs. So additionally, we have our hard cost vertical. Now I would think about this as the cost to construct the homes themselves. So in this template model, I have included a few models, 1A, 1B, 2A, 2B, 3A, 3B. I have some cost per square foot for the hard costs associated with those models. Likewise, I can add or delete units. Now, here's where we get into the forecast method. So for instance, let's take the unit 1A, and right now it's linked to my rent roll where I have six homes that are this model 1A, and each one of those models is 650 square feet each. And so I solve for that. I go 165 per square foot times number of homes times the square footage per home. That gets me 643,500 for this line item. I want that to begin in month 5 and end in month 14. So over that period, I'll be building these 6 homes. And because it's on a S-curve forecast, it will start low, and then it will increase like a normal distribution curve, and then it'll decrease towards the end, such that your largest outputs of cash flow are going to be in the middle and your lowest at the front and the end of that period. That's an S-curve. Now we can also go straight line, where it will be an even amount each period. Now I can also do, if I want, detail. Now how detail works is it converts all of these values out to the right to inputs, and I would manually input the values. So for instance, let's say that I have, some cost up front, 100,000. And then the balance of the cost happen over some period here, and let's say it's about 60,000. Okay, so you'll know whether you have entered a sufficient amount of cash flows out here to the right, because you'll get this incomplete. Okay, if I look right here, this is 700,000, but my budget is 643.5. So I need to pare this back a bit. 543.5 divided by 10. There we go. And once I have the correct amount out here to the right, that incomplete goes away. That's just an air check to confirm that the detailed cash flow forecast that I'm projecting out there equals my project budget. Now, if I want to revert back to S-curve, what I'll have to do is come here, click S-curve, and then I'll just need to borrow, say, this first formula, and then copy this out to the right, like so, and it converts it back to an S-curve. Now, that is then our hard cost section. Again, you have this option to forecast any of your cash flows using either the straight line, S-curve, or detail. Soft costs, just like the other sections, we can add items, we can delete items, we can forecast, straight line, S-curve, detail. We have some start period where those cash flows begin. We have some end period. Then we come to a total project cost before financing. So our unlevered project costs or unlevered uses. Then we layer in some debt. So the costs associated with the debt, we have capitalized construction interest, net of any lease-up income, and we can choose how much of our lease-up income is used to cover construction interest. So your lender may want to lower this a bit. Say we went to 75%. That adds a cushion in the event that there is less than the expected lease-up income, 90%. By default, I just have it here as 100%. We have financing fees. And so this would be the fees associated with, say, your construction loan or your acquisition and development loan. And you can choose when that funds. It always goes out straight line. Almost always you should just use the same period. So say 3 or 6. By default, it's just set to 0. Then so that gives us total uses. Once we add in the carry cost, it gives us a project budget or total uses of $16.95 million. Now, we need sufficient sources to cover these uses. And that's where we get to the sources section. And your sources are going to be a combination of equity and debt. And the debt, we have the option for up to 2 tranches of debt. And so you'll enter first what percentage of your sources are debt versus equity. So let's say we do 65% debt, the balance is equity. And then it asks, okay, of that 65, what is construction and what's mezz? So let's say we did 60% construction loan. That means mezz is going to be the balance 5, the remaining 5%. We can choose between a variable interest rate. And if we do a variable interest rate, out here to the right, we'll have to just enter what we expect the interest rate to be in each period going forward. If we do fixed, you'll just enter a value here. So let's say that this is a 9.5% rate. Let's say our mezz is at 14. We enter those values, and that will drive our capitalized construction interest in our project budget. Now, the other thing we can do is we can choose when the construction debt begins. So by default, it always assumes that equity goes out first, and once you've contributed the required amount of equity, construction debt will begin. But it may be that you want to put some early date on that. Perhaps you won't put debt on until land closing and you have a 12-month entitlement period. You could set, say, your construction debt to start in month 12, and that will limit that. Click to recalculate here. In this case now, I would need to come up here and set my land closing then to month 12, and that would ensure that I have sufficient cash flow to cover it. Yeah, roughly that. Actually, I'll need to, there's not enough equity to cover it, so I would need to have this happen in month 11. There we go. That ensures that the construction debt does not fund until at least month 11. Okay, then we have the option now to choose between a merchant build, meaning we sell at stabilization and our construction loan is taken out by proceeds from sale, or we can do a conversion to perm or a refinance, a build to core as it's referred to, where we take out our construction debt with permanent financing, and you click this perm debt, and that opens up our perm debt assumptions. Dollar amount, is it interest only or not? What is our annual rate? When would this fund? And by default, it's set to fund at stabilization, but you might change that value, what your loan fees are, and so forth. Let's take this back to no perm debt. Okay, then we come into operating period cash flows. And again, this is largely the same as our apartment development model, only you're going to see labels that are different. You start here where you enter some operation begin month, a rental growth rate, and when that rental growth rate begins. Here you have the first stabilized month, and that is determined by when you hit stabilization, when you're fully leased and you have fully hit your operating expenses. You have then your lease up method, and you can choose between basic or detailed. And if you do detailed, you basically, out to the right here, choose what percentage of the property is leased and at what periods. So right now, our construction ends at around month 19, and we begin leasing up at this stage at 20. Now, if we, for instance, had construction ending at 20, but we had certain homes that could be occupied prior to that, we might take back this operation begin month to say 14. And now out here to the right, you'll see that operation begins in month 14. We begin units taking occupancy, and we can either detail out the percentage of the units that are occupied, or we could click this basic, and it will do this straight line based on these assumptions. What percentage is pre-leased? How many homes will be leased up per month? And then what is the lease contract length? So here we have 6 units a month. We could take this back to 5, and you'll see that pushes our stabilization out 2 months. We could take it to 8. It pulls that up to month 21. Let's keep it at 6. We could have 100% pre-leased, in which case, starting in month 14, when our operation begins, we would have 100% of our units leased at that stage. Go back here to 10%. Then we get into the units themselves. And again, we can add units, or we could delete units, just like we can do up above. You have the model name, the number of homes for each of those models, the average square footage, whether there's free rent or not, either initially, that's during your very first lease up, and stabilized, that's past your first lease up and all future generation leases. You have your rent per square foot per month, and this will adapt to meters if you use meters. You have your rent per home per month, or chunk rent. And then you have your total rent per year before taking into account growth. And then here we have the home type. And this is just descriptive. So you might say I have a detached unit that would be a single family home, or I have a triplex attached. And that's descriptive for each one of your models. Here we have 62 total homes, average square feet of 902. We can scroll to the very top and see that that is 55,900 net rentable square feet. That's our NRA. Then we have our concessions free rent. Now this is our pro forma that we're building, our stabilized pro forma. And since we didn't put any free rent in here, you'll see that without free rent, there's no concessions or free rent in our stabilized pro forma. If we did include it in our stabilized period, then you would see some haircut for concessions. Gain or loss to lease by default is set to 0 in our pro forma. You will see gain or loss to lease out in your cash flows, but as it relates to a pro forma, which will ultimately drive our values, we assume no gain or loss to lease. And then we have the option to include a non-revenue model home. So in the template model, I just have 1 as my placeholder value. You could set that to 0. You could set that to 2, whatever the number is. It's essentially the number of homes that will not be leased, instead be used for marketing purposes. I'll leave that at 1. That gets us to total rental income. When you take our gross rent, you subtract any of those adjustments. Then we're going to add in other income. And I just have a few placeholders: cable, internet, pet income, trash income. Again, we can add or delete other income line items. I have some notes out here to the side, just like I had up here. That then gets us to, when we add in other income, total potential income. And then we subtract out general vacancy and credit loss. And we have the option to have this calculated either on total potential income, which is this bottom line, rent plus other income, or some prefer it to calculate rent just on total rental income, this line item here, or to calculate general vacancy on gross rent, which would be this number before taking into account adjustments. And so we would take a general vacancy and a credit loss assumption on each of those. I'm going to come back to total potential income. And that gets us to effective gross revenue. Then we subtract out operating expenses. Now, when we get into the expenses section, we first have, when does annual expense growth begin? And then we actually have an expense growth factor for each of our expense line items. We also have the option to choose our capital reserves above or below the line, above or below net operating income. And if they're below, that means that they're not included in our direct cap valuation, or our NOI divided by cap rate valuation. I'm going to keep that above NOI for now. And then I have some property tax assumptions. So you have your stabilized property tax value here. However, property taxes often are delayed, and just the nature of how the taxing agencies work. So depending on the jurisdiction, this is assuming that year 1 of operation, and here we have operation beginning month 14, 50% of our stabilized value is the property tax amount. In year 2, it's 75%. And then year 3 is when we hit full stabilization. And in this case, I've assumed, say, a 115 mill rate at approximately 90% of value, assessed value. It gets me to this 186.3. You'll have your own methodology for calculating property tax in whatever jurisdiction you're in. So we take our effective gross revenue, we subtract out our operating expenses, and we get net operating income, in this case of $971,345. Now, before I finish out operating expense section, or the operating cash flow section, this net operating income is before any growth, and you'll find it down here under untrended. So as of today, if we could snap our fingers and that stabilized pro forma existed, again, there's that 971,345, that would result in a value at a 5.5 cap, which we enter here, a value of $17.66 million today. And we compare that $17.66 million value today to our project budget of $16.756 million, and there's approximately a million of value creation from the development. Again, these are all placeholder values. It's simply meant to be a working model. You then take it and change every blue font cell for your scenario. But that's our untrended value. We also have a trended value. So this takes our cash flows here, and it grows those cash flows by whatever our growth rates are, both income and expense. And it arrives at a trended value. And in this case, because stabilization occurs in month 24, our first stabilized year is month 24 through 35. And we have a stabilized NOI of 976 on a trended basis. And at a 5.5 cap, that's a $17.751 million value. So slightly higher than untrended, and that's because there wasn't a lot of period to trend. There was only about 6 to 12 months of actual trended cash flows. If it took longer to stabilize, or we had the growth begin sooner, the delta between your untrended and trended is going to be higher. So we get below net operating income, we add in some operating or some capital expenditures. That gets us to a cash flow from operation. We then have some additional inputs. We have market cap rate today. We have cap rate at sale. And the reason those are different is your cap rate, you might forecast a cap rate out in the future that's different than what prevailing market cap rates are today. You have some selling costs as a percentage of your sales price. And then we've got the month in which you sell the property. And right now it is by default 12 months following your stabilization. We might do more than that. We might say, okay, we're going to hold this through the end of year 4. But by default, the model assumes 12 months following stabilization. You get then a sale pro forma here. That would start in month 36 through month 47. It gets you a net operating income of $1.8 million. Capping that again at a 5 is a sales price of $18.33 million. So you have some appreciation from when you stabilize, whether untrended or trended, to your sale. That 18.33 minus I think it was a $16.6 million budget gives you almost $2 million of profit, plus the cash flows earned in the interim. Such that when we get into the returns, what we'll see, first, here's our net levered cash flow line. Actually, it looked like my unlevered had been hidden. I'm not sure why that got hid. Okay, here we go. So now we get into our returns. You have some of your summary cash flows all being shown there. But really what we care about here is our net unlevered cash flow and our net levered cash flow, as well as their respective returns, equity multiple, IRR, net profit for each. So then the model calculates development spread, which is your yield on cost less the prevailing market cap rate. Finally, the model then takes those project level cash flows and runs them through a partnership waterfall. There are various inputs here, including should we include or not include the development fee in the return calculations for the GP? Should we include some GP level fees, such as an AUM fee, in addition to the development fee? And so all of that is part of these inputs here. We see then a summary of returns to the LP and the GP. And we would actually enter the GP's name here. GP Co, LP Co, right? You see the contribution requirements of each of the partners based on here a 10% contribution share by the GP. This could go to say 5. Now the LP is contributing 95% and the GP is required to put in 190,000. And then we get into the hurdles. This is your hurdle rate, and this would be the promote. So above a 9 would be a 15 to a 12. Above a 12 would be a 30 to a 15. And then above a 15 would be a 40. That's the promote paid to the GP, such that the distribution paid to the GP, say in this hurdle, the third tier, would be 34%, Or put another way, the GP would receive a 30% promote. The remaining 70% would be split 95% to the LP, 5% to the GP, such that the distribution owed to the GP in this third tier would be 34% of all cash flow. Again, until the LP hit a 15. And then above a 15, 43% would go to the GP. 40% in promote plus 5% of the remaining 60%. You can see the breakdown of cash flows, both distributions and contributions to each of the partners there. The other thing we have the option to do is to run a double promote. So this would be a scenario, I click this double promote button, where you have an LP and a GP structure, but you also have a co-GP structure. So this would be the second waterfall where there's a co-GP, GP1, GP2. So you might have here, developer co, and you might have GP investors. And maybe the developer co puts in 25%. And so of this $188,000, $189,000 contribution requirement of the GP, perhaps the GP investors would contribute 75% of that, or $142,000, and say the developer co might contribute $47,000. And then likewise, there's a waterfall for this second waterfall. So that is the underwriting tab, and all of that produces the cash flows that are needed for the outputs. And here on the summary tab, and I won't get too much into it because it's effectively a summary of outputs from all of the inputs that were added to your underwriting tab. But in terms of sections, we have this investment description section above where you can drop in strengths and weaknesses, and you can drop in, say, an image, representative image of the investment. You have key assumptions and return metrics here. There's a tool where we can actually size the investment, the land, to hit some minimum development spread. So you click this and say, okay, I want a minimum 50, and it's actually going to change the land price to some number, in this case now 2.264 million, such that our development spread here is, say, 50. And I can do this again. Let's go to 100. Now that's going to size my land. So I'd have to pay, I could only pay 1.167 million if I wanted to hit a development spread of 100 basis points. That's our key assumptions and return metrics. Then we get into the property level cash flow section, where you're going to see that visualized in 6 charts, as well as some returns visualized in 6 charts. Project costs, uses by month, kind of see a breakdown of that, and then here each of the project costs, land, hard, soft, and carry, represented by colors. You've got then your equity and debt. So you see equity comes out first and the debt comes out second, and you have each by color. Then you have net operating income, and you see where operation begins month 14, we hit break even month 17, we stabilize right around that month 24 or 25. And then here to the right, you see the development spread, untrended, trended, and sale. You see equity IRR by partner. You see equity multiple by partner. And then you have this option for the annual cash flow report. We can click the show button. And what that does is this opens up this annual cash flow tab. Here it's printable, and it is essentially the same cash flows that we see on the underwriting tab, just summarized to annual periods. The last thing I want to show, actually 2 things. First, you can unhide the data tab. And this has, for one, the list of home types. This is the drop-down list, so you can edit these values if you want. It has the steepness of your S-curve. So right now I'm using, it's out of a scale out of 1 to 10, 1 being flat, 10 being the steepest. I can make it a highly steep S-curve, look something more like that, such that here in my project cash flows, you're going to get a much steeper. In fact, we were looking at this one, right? You'll see in this case now when we go very steep, max steep, we start in the very first period, very minimal output, and that grows to a high there in your middle months and then pairs back. So if we came here and let's say we made this though something more flat, say a 3. You go 3, it's closer, closer to a straight line. So by default, this is set to 6, which is, in my view, kind of representative of what most people expect from an S-curve, but you can make that curve steeper or flatter depending on your situation. And then finally, underwriting tab. If I come back to the operating cash flow section, you're going to see here under operating expenses this option for detailed operating expenses. Now, if I click this, it says, are you sure you want to detail your operating expenses? This will override any values currently entered into expenses. If anything I already had here are going to be deleted. Okay, let's do that. And what will happen is it will open up this detail expense worksheet. And you can actually detail each of your summary expense items. So repairs and maintenance right now is a single line item. You can detail that out. Same for payroll, G&A, marketing, utilities, contract services, capital reserve, insurance, property taxes. So you do that sort of detailing such that these values, now you'll notice these turn to green font. Green font represents a link to a separate worksheet. And if I go back to basic, it's going to override the values, turn them back into inputs, but you'll notice it is the values that were created as part of our detail analysis, and anything I had prior to switching to detailed is now lost. Now, you also are seeing this red click to recalculate button appear as we run through our analysis, and this is the last thing I'll talk through. This is a macro that iterates to solve for construction interest. And it's important that anytime the model needs to be updated, you'll click this button, it will run a macro, which you can find by going to your developer ribbon, Visual Basic, and here under modules, you're going to see all the macros in the model. And here under the general macro, there's a recalculate macro. And I have instructions in green, notes within the code, in case you want to come in and edit this. And this code essentially runs anytime you click this click to recalculate red button. And it's just going to iterate. And what it actually does is it simply changes this value here. You'll notice that this is a black font cell, and yet it's just a hard-coded value. Well, this value is changed by that macro. And what it's solving for is it's solving such that the percentage of uses equals your LTC input. So it'll just manually do something like this. Oops. And it will iterate over and over again until that equals 65%. And so rather than us having to manually do that, I just have a macro that automatically changes this value until this equals your input. So that is my build to rent development model. Again, this is the initial release. There's going to be changes to this, both bug fixes and some new features. And so as I release new features, I'll look to put out additional videos. But if you have any questions, if you catch a bug or there's a feature you want to add, please let us know. Otherwise, thanks for your time.